taken as a toddler, found after 41 years, the Michelle Newton case. For more than 4 decades, one little girl existed in 2 completely different worlds. In one world, she was a missing child whose photograph appeared on posters, police bulletins, and missing person databases. Her father never stopped wondering whether she was safe, whether she remembered him, or whether she even knew someone was still searching for her. In the other world, she was growing up under a different identity, unaware that authorities had spent years trying to find her. The life she knew was built on a story that investigators would later discover was incomplete. Then, more than 41 years after she disappeared, a single lead changed everything. Kentucky investigators received information that reopened one of the state's oldest unresolved child abduction cases. The trail eventually led hundreds of miles away, where DNA testing confirmed what one family had hoped for since 1983. Michelle Newton was alive. It wasn't the ending many expected. It wasn't the dramatic rescue seen in movies. Instead, it was a quiet moment in which decades of uncertainty finally gave way to the truth. For Michelle's father, the search that had defined much of his adult life had finally reached an answer. But that answer also raised new questions. How does a child disappear for more than 40 years without being found? How does someone discover, as an adult, that the life they've always known began with a kidnapping? And how do families begin rebuilding after losing 4 decades that can never be returned? Those questions begin in Kentucky during the spring of 1983. Before we continue, where are you watching from today? Leave your city in the comments. Cases like Michelle's remind us that someone, somewhere, may hold the missing piece that brings a family back together. Michelle Marie Newton was only 3 years old when her life changed forever. Publicly available records about Michelle's early childhood are limited, and investigators have intentionally kept many personal details private out of respect for her and her family. What is known is that she lived in Kentucky and was loved by a father who maintained hope long after many people believed the search would never end. Like countless parents involved in custody disputes, Michelle's family faced legal challenges that were expected to be resolved through the courts. Instead, those disputes took a completely different path. On April 2, 1983, Michelle disappeared after being taken by her non-custodial mother, Deborah Lee Curry Newton. Authorities classified the disappearance as a parental abduction. Although parental kidnappings often receive less public attention than stranger abductions, investigators understand they can be just as devastating. When a parent violates a custody order and disappears with a child, locating that child can become extraordinarily difficult. Names can be changed. Addresses can change repeatedly. Records become harder to trace. As years pass, children may grow up without knowing they were ever reported missing. That possibility became one of the defining challenges in Michelle's case. Law enforcement entered her information into national missing person systems. Her disappearance remained active. Years became decades. Her father continued waiting. Public records do not contain many interviews describing Michelle's personality before she disappeared. And rather than invent details, it is important to remember her through the facts that are known. She was a little girl whose future was suddenly separated from the family searching for her. She deserved the opportunity to know both sides of her family and to make her own choices about her future. Instead, investigators believe those choices were taken away when she disappeared in 1983. Now that you know who Michelle was, does her story remind you of another missing child whose case stayed with you? Sharing their names helps keep their memories alive. At first, investigators believed there was still time. Many parental abduction cases are resolved within days or weeks. Police immediately began gathering information about Michelle's disappearance. They documented custody information, collected descriptions, and worked to determine where she and her mother might have gone. As leads developed, officers followed every credible report they received. But each lead eventually reached another dead end. Without modern digital databases, nationwide surveillance systems, or instant information sharing, tracking someone across state lines in 1983 was far more difficult than it would be today. Investigators relied on witness statements, paper records, vehicle registrations, and cooperation between agencies. If someone deliberately avoided detection, years could pass before another reliable lead appeared. That is exactly what happened. Weeks turned into months. Months became years. The little girl whose photograph investigators circulated slowly grew older. Age-progressed images became an important investigative tool, showing what Michelle might look like as she entered adolescence and adulthood. Although the images changed, the missing person file remained the same, open, unresolved. For Michelle's father, every birthday represented another reminder of time lost. Every holiday passed without knowing where his daughter was. Every phone call carried the possibility that investigators had finally found something. But for decades, that call never came. As the years passed, the investigation settled into a rhythm that many cold cases unfortunately share. Every new lead brought hope. Every dead end brought disappointment. But Michelle Newton's case was never officially forgotten. Law enforcement agencies continued maintaining her missing person record, ensuring that if new information ever surfaced, investigators would have a foundation to build upon. For Michelle's father, the passage of time never lessened the loss. Friends and relatives moved forward with their lives. Communities changed. Technology advanced. Yet one question remained exactly the same as it had been in 1983. Where was Michelle? Unlike stranger abductions that often generate national headlines for weeks, parental abductions can gradually disappear from public attention. Investigators understand that these cases present unique challenges because the child may be living under a different name, enrolled in school elsewhere, and surrounded by people who have no reason to suspect anything is wrong. That possibility complicated every stage of Michelle's case. Detectives considered numerous possibilities over the years. Had Michelle remained in Kentucky? Had she been taken to another state? Had her identity been legally or informally changed? Without reliable evidence placing her in any specific location, every possibility had to remain open. As investigative methods improved, so did the opportunities to revisit old cases. The introduction of computerized databases made it easier for agencies to compare missing person records. Digital record systems replaced many paper files. DNA technology transformed criminal investigations across the United States. Cases once considered impossible to solve were suddenly producing answers decades later. Michelle's disappearance benefited from those advances. Although there was no dramatic crime scene to re-examine, investigators could compare historical records with modern databases in ways that simply had not been possible during the early 1980s. Even with improved technology, however, breakthroughs still depended on information. Someone had to remember. Someone had to recognize a name. Someone had to make a phone call. For years, that call never came. The case remained active, but public updates were limited. Law enforcement deliberately withheld certain investigative details, a common practice intended to protect the integrity of an ongoing investigation. As a result, much of the work happened quietly behind the scenes. Detectives changed. Supervisors retired. New investigators inherited the file. Each generation of officers reviewed the same reports, hoping fresh eyes might notice something that had been overlooked. For Michelle's father, the emotional burden never truly disappeared. Although public records reveal little about his private life during those decades, investigators have acknowledged that he continued searching and never gave up hope that his daughter might still be alive. That persistence became one of the defining elements of the case. Unlike many missing person investigations where hope fades with time, Michelle's family continued believing that answers were still possible. More than 40 years after Michelle disappeared, something finally changed. In 2025, Kentucky investigators received a tip through Crime Stoppers. At first glance, it may have seemed like many other tips received over the years. Cold cases often generate hundreds or even thousands of leads. Most ultimately lead nowhere. But detectives are trained to evaluate every credible piece of information carefully, regardless of how much time has passed. This lead was different. It directed investigators toward Florida. As detectives began following the information, they discovered evidence suggesting that Michelle might have been living there under a different identity. Years of investigative work suddenly began moving much faster. Authorities coordinated with agencies in Florida to verify the information before contacting the woman they believed could be Michelle Newton. Even after decades, investigators understood that assumptions were not enough. They needed scientific confirmation. DNA testing became the final step. Samples were collected and compared. The results confirmed what detectives had hoped, and what Michelle's father had waited more than 4 decades to hear. The missing 3-year-old from Kentucky had been found alive. The announcement marked the successful resolution of one of Kentucky's oldest unresolved parental child abduction cases. Investigators spent decades preserving Michelle's case until one credible tip changed everything. If you had been working this investigation, what clue would you have focused on most? Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments. For Michelle's family, however, finding her was only the beginning. 41 years had passed. An entire lifetime had unfolded between the day she disappeared and the day she was identified. Rebuilding relationships after so much time would require patience, understanding, and respect for experiences that no one could ever fully recover. For Michelle herself, the discovery meant learning that the story of her childhood was very different from what she had always believed. That realization would become one of the most emotional chapters of the entire case. For more than 40 years, Michelle's father waited without knowing whether he would ever see his daughter again. If you've ever waited years for an answer that finally came, your experience reminds us why hope matters. The confirmation that Michelle Newton had been found alive brought an end to one chapter of the story, but it also marked the beginning of another. For more than 41 years, Michelle had lived a life built around the identity she had always known. According to investigators, she had no knowledge that she had once been listed as one of Kentucky's longest missing children. The revelation was life-changing. Unlike many missing person cases that end with dramatic rescues or courtroom testimony, Michelle's case ended quietly. There were no police helicopters, no nationwide manhunt, no television cameras capturing the exact moment of reunion. Instead, the most important moment happened privately, when DNA testing confirmed what investigators had spent decades trying to prove. Michelle Newton was alive. Authorities later announced that her biological mother, Deborah Lee Curry Newton, had been arrested in connection with Michelle's disappearance. According to law enforcement, the arrest related to custodial interference stemming from the original 1983 abduction. For investigators, the arrest represented accountability after more than 4 decades. For Michelle's father, it represented something different. After years of unanswered questions, he finally knew what had happened to his daughter. Although public officials have shared the broad outline of the reunion, they have also respected the family's privacy by withholding many personal details. That decision reflects an important principle in cases like this. The public has an interest in understanding how a missing person investigation was solved, but survivors and their families also deserve the opportunity to rebuild their lives away from public attention. Michelle's story reminds us that recovery does not begin the day someone is found. Recovery begins with rebuilding trust, reconnecting with family members who have spent decades apart, learning about birthdays that were missed, milestones that passed, photographs that were never taken together. No investigation can restore those lost years, but it can provide something equally important: the truth. Throughout the investigation, law enforcement repeatedly demonstrated why missing person cases should never be considered hopeless simply because time has passed. Advances in investigative databases, improved communication between agencies, persistent detectives willing to reopen old files, and one credible tip. Together, those elements solved a case that had remained unanswered for 41 years. Michelle's case also highlights the unique challenges surrounding parental abductions. These cases often receive less media attention than stranger kidnappings, yet their impact on children and families can be equally profound. When a child is removed from one parent and raised under another identity, the consequences may not become fully understood until decades later. That is why investigators continue treating parental abductions as serious crimes, requiring long-term commitment. For Michelle's father, hope became the one thing that time could not erase. Many families eventually face pressure to accept uncertainty, to stop expecting answers, to move forward. Yet Michelle's case demonstrates that hope and persistence can coexist for decades. Without investigators continuing to review evidence, without someone choosing to report information, without advances in investigative techniques, Michelle might never have been identified. Instead, A father who spent more than 40 years searching for his daughter finally learned she was alive. That outcome is extraordinarily rare. It serves as a reminder that every unresolved case deserves continued attention, not because every story ends the same way, but because no family should lose hope simply because time has passed. We're about to leave Michelle's story behind. Before we do, what do you think made the biggest difference in solving this case after 41 years? A witness who came forward, determined investigators, or advances in modern investigative methods? Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments. Today, Michelle Newton's case stands as one of Kentucky's longest-running missing child investigations to reach a resolution. It is a testament to the determination of investigators who refused to close the file. It is a testament to a father who never stopped believing. And it is a reminder that behind every missing person poster is a family waiting for answers. Some cases end in heartbreak, others remain unsolved. Michelle's story ended with a reunion that many believed would never happen. Although 41 years can never be returned, the truth finally was. If this documentary reminded you why forgotten cases still matter, consider subscribing to the Silence Evidence. Every episode is built on verified facts, official records, and respect for the people whose stories deserve to be remembered. Every case deserves an answer. Every family deserves the truth.